A particularly exciting seashell must have caught the lady's attention. She bent over, completely absorbed with interest. Jane wondered at her fascination and wished that she knew more about the interesting objects that the sea spat out upon the sand. However, it seems that her life was doomed to the boring banalities approved of by Aunt Adolpha and nothing else. Jane dropped her gaze to her feet and hurried her pace. It would be awkward to abruptly intrude by forcing her acquaintance upon the couple, especially considering how perfectly horrid Aunt Adolpha would be about Jane disobeying social protocol. Perhaps she would have the chance at an introduction at a later date. She hurried her pace and made her way back home. The tea was just being laid out when Jane entered the room. Aunt Adolpha gave her an appraising glance and said, "Your hair looks frightful. I suppose you enjoyed your walk." "Yes, Aunt Adolpha." "Well, I am nearly famished. Please pour the tea." After tea, Jane reached for a very interesting-looking book about the sea, but was interrupted by Aunt Adolpha's sharp scrutiny. "I'm quite surprised that you feel you have time to waste on silly books. I should think your unfinished embroidery was much more pressing." Jane sighed and tucked the book back on the shelf. Her embroidery was feeling a bit tedious lately, as Aunt Adolpha was always inspecting it for mistakes and having Jane do it over again. She bent over her needlework and made some progress before pricking herself. She attempted to stifle a gasp. The needle had gone rather deep this time. In order to avoid bleeding on her sampler, which would incur the deep annoyance of her aunt, Jane reached for a newspaper lying on the nearby table. She hoped that her aunt had already read the society pages for the day, since a drop of blood had marred one of the names. There was a picture above the blood-soaked name. The drawing was unmistakable. She instantly recognized Gabriel Stevens, but the article described him as a man called Miserrimus Dexter, a known con man as well as a convicted felon who had only recently escaped from Newgate prison. Could this be true? And if so, how did this man know about her? Aunt Adolpha, the society pages, Gabriel Stevens, it says here he is called Miserrimus Dexter and he is an escaped convict. Jane held up the paper to show her aunt the picture. Aunt Adolpha paled and dropped her needlework. "Aunt Adolpha, are you ill? Hannah, my aunt requires a glass of wine." After gingerly sipping the wine, color returned to Adolpha's face. "Jane, I had hoped never to have to tell you about your father's unfortunate half-brother, but it seems that the decision has been taken out of my hands. Miserrimus Dexter was born to your father's mother before, well, to be frank, before she was respectably married to your grandfather Gerald." "Grandmother Mary? I don't understand." "Mary was a very impetuous creature and should have taken more care of her virtue," Aunt Adolpha snapped out hurriedly. She rose and began pacing the room. "I never heard who the father was of your unfortunate uncle, but it was obviously quite a wicked person and his blood tainted the child. When Gerald married Mary, he took on the boy as well, but only on the condition that he should be sent away to school and his existence explained away as a ward of the family. Under no circumstances was he to inherit the family name or have any claim as a son or heir. Your dear father wanted to help his miserable half-brother, but was treated heinously. He severed all connections with your uncle from that point forward." Aunt Adolpha paused in her pacing to sniff her smelling salts. Jane gripped the newspaper and examined the picture again. How brazen he must have been to appear before us undisguised and with nothing but a false name to deceive us. He hadn't much to lose, as I never met the man. Oh, if only your mother had heeded my advice and avoided marriage, this scandal would never have darkened my door. This sounded a bit like Aunt Adolpha begrudged Jane's existence, but Jane did not have time to think about that, as her aunts immediately suggested that they should consult the police. Hours later, 2 officers were shown into the drawing room. Jane couldn't help but notice the younger officer with his tall stature and handsome features. His piercing blue eyes met Jane's, and she quickly looked away. The older officer nodded his head to her and Aunt Adolpha and introduced himself. "Good evening, ladies. I am Sergeant Cuff, and this is Officer Hamley. If you could please state the case very clearly, starting from the beginning, we will do our best to get to the bottom of the trouble." Aunt Adolpha poured out their worries to the stoic older officer, who occasionally asked a question or jotted down a note. After nearly an hour and many glances between the handsome young officer and Jane, the case had been documented and the two men prepared to take their leave. Jane and Aunt Adolpha saw quite a lot of Officer Hamley over the next few weeks as he visited them often to consult about the case. A few days after Miss Dexter was apprehended, Officer Hamley stopped by to reassure the two ladies of their safety. When Hannah showed him into the drawing room, Jane was sitting by herself. It was early in the day, and Aunt Adolpha had spent the morning in her room to recover from a headache. Officer Hamley bowed neatly and offered Jane a nosegay. "I hope it is not too bold to say, but a lovely lady should always be surrounded by flowers." Jane blushed and smiled sweetly at the flattery. "Thank you, Officer Hamley. They are beautiful. I hope you will call me William, as we have gotten to know each other so well." Jane felt a thrill of delight at this breach of formality. Aunt Adolpha would be scandalized. Jane herself was rather shocked to realize how much she enjoyed Officer Hamley's visits. She was beginning to feel rather smitten if she admitted the truth to herself. Now you must choose. Should Jane avoid seeing Officer Hamley, or should she continue seeing Officer Hamley?